Proof: Oswald did not shoot President Kennedy. A presentation of Publius Productions. Narrated on March the 12th, 2020. Permission is hereby granted to make copies. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I will be the one presenting this material. I am an historian and writer who has published 4 books and produced 27 DVDs, many of which are on the internet. And one of the areas I've looked into is the assassination of President John Kennedy in 1963. I have researched the evidence, and I will present it during this presentation. And that evidence has led me to conclude that Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, did not shoot the president. I want you to know that I have no staff assisting me and no researchers doing my research. No one advising me and no one funding my work. I am totally responsible for what you will see and hear as I proceed through this material. This event took place 57 years ago, and there are certainly many who were not alive when this event took place. So I shall first present a brief review of the history of the assassination. We must start with the date of November the 22nd, 1963, the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. The president and his wife Jackie had been invited to the state of Texas, and specifically to the city of Dallas. That morning their airplane, called Air Force One, landed at Love Field, and they were greeted by the dignitaries and then by a very enthusiastic public. They then entered a Lincoln limousine along with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, and 2 Secret Service agents as driver and co-driver. The limousine was driven on a prescribed route through the streets of Dallas, and near the end, the car turned right off of Main Street onto Houston Street and then made a left turn onto Elm Street. When they got to this left turn, they were south of the Texas School Book Depository. As the car was driven down Elm, at least 3 shots were fired at the president, 2 of which struck him. It appears that the 3rd shot was the fatal shot, and the Kennedy car was then raced to Parkland Hospital several miles away. The result: President John Kennedy was assassinated on November the 22nd, 1963. After the president had died, Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president. Lady Bird, Johnson's wife, and Jackie, the wife of President Kennedy, were in attendance. Shortly after the funeral of the president, President Johnson named Earl Warren Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and 6 other members, and they formed what has been called the Warren Commission to determine who was the assassin. The completed report was called the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Report of the Warren Commission, and it was delivered to the President on September the 24th, 1964. This is a copy of the shorter New York Times edition of the report of the Warren Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. The introduction to the report says this: "This complete, authoritative edition of the Warren Commission report includes all the text in every single one of the vitally important exhibits. And one of those vitally important exhibits is a picture taken by James Altgens, an Associated Press photographer. And this is a repeat of the overview of the Dealey Plaza. Mr. Altgens was on the opposite side of Elm Street, facing the depository building and the Kennedy car approaching him. And this is his entire photograph. You can see the Kennedy car approaching him. This is a close-up of the car, and this green rectangle shows the president reaching for his throat with both hands. That white square is the sleeve on his left arm. That means the Altgens photograph was taken right after the president was struck by the first shot to the throat area. But there is more that we have to examine in this photograph. This, once again, is the entire photograph. And this is a closer look at the doorway of the depository in the background. And I want to discuss this individual standing in the doorway of the School Book Depository. Let me first explain that the depository building is a daylight basement, and you do not walk straight into the building to get inside. You have to climb these stairs, which means you would be on the second floor of the depository. So it is possible for people to be standing on the landing above the stairs and before you entered the building, and that you would have a slightly elevated view of Houston Street and Elm Street leading to the right away from the depository. This is a close-up of the man in the depository doorway, and as the Warren Commission began to examine this picture, it was quickly noted that the man in the doorway looked amazingly like Lee Harvey Oswald. We need to study this close-up of the man in the doorway with regard to three things. Number one, the neck of the t-shirt. Number two, the fact that the shirt was not buttoned all the way to the belt line, but was unbuttoned about 2/3 of the way down. And number three, the strange bend in the shirt's left side. The man in the doorway is wearing what appears to be a V-necked t-shirt. It appears to be stretched due to wear. The shirt is not buttoned except at the end where it appears to be buttoned, and the lapel on the right side has an unusual bend in it. And the Warren Commission reached the conclusion that the man in the doorway was not Lee Harvey Oswald. It was Billy Lovelady, who also worked in the depository at the time of the shooting. I would suggest that you keep this slide in mind, because how they reached this conclusion is a major story by itself. So now let me return to the narrative about the assassination of President John Kennedy. The Warren Commission declared that Lee Harvey Oswald worked at the Texas School Book Depository and was in the 6th floor window and fired a rifle at the president as he was driven down Elm Street. He left the depository building within minutes of the assassination, and for some reason he later entered this theater without purchasing a ticket. The ticket seller called the police, and officers arrived and went into the theater to find the guilty party. The policeman is standing behind the seat that Oswald was occupying. And Oswald was arrested and later taken outside the theater. He was then taken to the Dallas Police Department in the City Hall. I would now like to show you some photographs of Oswald while he was being questioned by the police department. I am specifically going to look at three things. Number one, his t-shirt. Number two, the buttoning of the shirt he was wearing. And number three, the right side of his shirt. This is picture number one. It is hard to see, but you can vaguely see that his t-shirt has a V-neck. This appears to be a mugshot of Oswald with his shirt off, and the t-shirt is definitely a V-neck. I have pointed to a rather strange bulge or bend on the right side of his shirt. Notice that the shirt is not buttoned from the top to the bottom. The second picture shows the same three things: the V-neck t-shirt, the bulge or bend in the shirt, and the fact that his shirt is not buttoned all the way down. And picture number 3 appears to show the same conditions: a V-neck t-shirt, a strange bulge or bend in the right side of his shirt, and the shirt is not totally buttoned. This will be picture number 4 and the last picture in the sequence. Once again we see a V-neck t-shirt, the bulge or bend on the right side of his shirt, and the shirt has not been buttoned until near the bottom of his shirt. Now it is time to draw some conclusions. Let me start by pointing out that the Warren Commission drew one major conclusion, and that was that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And it certainly would not fit that scenario when a photograph showed up of Lee Harvey Oswald on the stairway of the way to the second floor of the depository building. Because if Oswald was on the second floor, he certainly could not have been in the 6th floor at the same time. And he was not in the 6th floor window and someone else was. That means there was a conspiracy, defined as 2 or more people meeting in secret with an evil purpose. Now let me put these 2 photographs side by side. If the man in the doorway was Billy Lovelady, it is an astronomical circumstance that his clothing appears to match that of Lee Harvey Oswald. But there were no known photographs of Billy Lovelady for some time after the assassination. But the Warren Commission said the man in the doorway was Billy Lovelady. And how they came to that conclusion is a major story by itself. Mark Lane, one of the early critics of the Warren Commission, wrote this in the problem wrote this about this problem in his book entitled Brush to Judgment, published in 1966, about 3 years after the assassination. These comments come from pages 354 and 355. New York Tribune newspaper requested a photograph of Lovelady from the FBI. They responded that it could not furnish a photograph of Lovelady at that time. The San Francisco Chronicle asked the Associated Press for a picture of Lovelady. They responded that they would be unable to comply because none existed. Bill Beckman, a Fort Worth photographer, went to Dallas in an attempt to get Lovelady's picture, for which he was placed in custody by the Dallas police. He was taken to the police department headquarters, questioned in the police department surveillance, and then released. He was advised to leave Dallas without a picture. And for the record, I haven't found any reference as to why Mr. Beckman was treated this way, but it is clear they did not want him getting a photograph of Billy Lovelady. Mr. Lane then discussed the testimony of William Shelley, another depository employee, who told the FBI that he was standing just outside the doors of the depository on the entrance, and that at the time of the first shot, I was standing at the same place. He then said Billy Lovelady, who works under my supervision, was seated on the entrance steps just in front of me. Shelley testified twice before counsel, but he was not asked about Lovelady's posture on either occasion. And if Mr. Shelley's testimony is accurate, and he said that Mr. Lovelady worked for him, he certainly would be capable of recognizing him sitting on the steps in front of him. Therefore, Lovelady could not be the man in the doorway. But the Warren Commission said that he was. I would next like to discuss the reason Oswald's shirt was not buttoned from the top to the bottom. This is his actual shirt, as preserved by the Dallas Police Department. First, look at the photograph of Oswald on the left, and you will see that it appears as if the shirt is only held together by one button near the bottom. Then notice that there are two buttons still on the shirt, and two missing buttons. This is the reason that Oswald's shirt was only buttoned at the bottom. There were missing buttons near the top. Now it is time to start dealing with the issue that it appears as if the image of the man in the doorway has been altered to look like Billy Lovelady. Let's start with the presumption that the man was in the reality Lee Harvey Oswald. As I've said before, because if it was really Oswald, it posed a real problem to the Warren Commission and the FBI, because if Oswald was on the second floor, he could not have been on the sixth floor. They had to do something, or their entire premise of Oswald being the lone gunman in the assassination would collapse entirely. But as we have seen, there were no photographs of Lovelady. So the FBI had to somehow obtain photographs of him so that they could alter the Altgens photograph to make certain that the picture was not of Oswald. So the FBI asked Lovelady to appear before their members so that pictures could be taken of him. And on February 29th, 1964, only about 2 months after the assassination, Billy Lovelady appeared as requested, and these 3 pictures of him were taken. The first question that one must ask is, why did they take these pictures in the first place? They look like they could have been mugshots for someone who's being booked. And secondly, we must ask why Lovelady allowed them to take them. He certainly was not a suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. One conclusion could be that the FBI needed to obtain photographs of Lovelady so that they could alter the Altgens photograph of the man in the doorway. Jim Marrs discussed this in his book entitled Crossfire, published in 1989, with these words. Later, Lovelady explained the discrepancies in the 2 shirts, meaning between the shirt worn by the man in the doorway and the shirt he was wearing on February 29, 1963. By telling CBS News, when they took my picture that day in the wide striped shirt, I told them it wasn't the same shirt I wore on the day of the assassination. It appears as if the FBI already had this photograph of Lovelady in a plaid shirt, so they knew he had worn the plaid shirt on November the 22nd, 1963. They wanted frontal and side pictures of his head so they could put them onto the figure of the man in the doorway. If they had taken pictures of him in the plaid shirt, it might be a giveaway that they had used these pictures of Lovelady to alter the photograph of the man in the doorway in the Altgens photograph. So, in my opinion, they had to do this before the Warren Commission would complete a report and deliver it to President Johnson on September the 24th, 1964. So just to show the two dates together, they took the Lovelady pictures on February the 29th, 1964, and they delivered them in the Warren Commission report on September the 24th, also 1964. So now the world believes that it was really Lovelady in the doorway when it was, in truth, Lee Harvey Oswald. The FBI succeeded. Now let me focus on one very distinct feature of Mr. Lovelady, the rather interesting half-circle spot in the middle of his hairline. I would guess that it's rather rare among men of this age. But now the FBI had a full frontal and side view picture of the real Billy Lovelady, and they could insert the half circle in his hairline as evidence that the man in the doorway was the real Lovelady. It is now time to bring the last piece of the puzzle into focus, and that is this book entitled The Killing of a President by Robert J. Groden, published in 1993. Mr. Groden interviewed Billy Lovelady in 1976 and asked him to wear the shirt he wore on the day of the assassination, and he published this picture. You will notice he's wearing a multiple colored long sleeve shirt and that he wore a t-shirt underneath it. Mr. Lovelady did not button the shirt all the way up, preferring to leave the top button unbuttoned. This is certainly not the way the man in the doorway treated his plaid shirt, because that shirt was basically unbuttoned. And this shirt was capable of being buttoned all the way to the top. Of course, this picture was taken at least 13 years after the assassination. So the FBI could not have used this picture to alter the Altgens photograph. But you can see that the 1976 shirt could have been used to overlay the exact shirt that Oswald was wearing. But the man in the doorway could not button his shirt all the way up because he was wearing the shirt that Oswald was wearing with missing buttons. Now I would like to share my conclusion that what we have seen, the man in the doorway, was really Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Warren Commission quickly figured it out. And I believe the FBI used this picture, which appears to be Billy Lovelady, while he was on the street level in front of the depository shortly after the assassination. This picture is a profile, meaning the observer cannot see his face. And if somebody was going to alter a picture of someone in a frontal shot, you would need a picture of the face of the man in the profile. Because the Altgens photograph was an exhibit in the Warren Commission report itself, turned over to President Johnson on September the 24th of 1964. But it doesn't matter, because the man in the doorway was wearing a shirt that you could not button, and that is what the official version of the man in the doorway is wearing. This issue is all about a shirt that could not be buttoned because it lacked several buttons. In all of my research, which has been conducted into at least 53 books by the major writers on the Kennedy assassination, I do not recall I have ever seen anyone claim this man was Billy Lovelady. So we are left with this. I still am amazed at the probability of Billy Lovelady being shown in the Altgens photograph wearing clothing that matched the clothing that Lee Harvey Oswald was wearing while he was being questioned by the Dallas Police Department. The chances have to be astronomical. So I must go with the unbuttoned shirt and conclude once again that the man in the doorway was Lee Harvey Oswald, and that the Warren Commission knew it, and the FBI knew it, and together they framed an innocent man. I will end with this quote found in the book entitled Crossfire, written by Jim Mars. He quotes Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry as saying, "We don't have any proof that Lee Harvey Oswald fired the rifle, and never did. Nobody's been able to put him in that building with a gun in his hands, and the reason is because Lee Harvey Oswald was the man in the doorway on the second floor of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas, Texas, at the time of the first shot of the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The Warren Commission and the FBI framed an innocent